Is licensure for personal trainers a realistic route for the future of this industry? Stay tuned. Welcome to a special edition of the KIPS Podcast. My name is Tyler Valencia, and I am the president of KIPS. In this episode, we have two guests that have been at the forefront of licensure and registry. That is Graham Melstrand and Francis Neric. These gentlemen have been working with different organizations, spoken on different panels. And this episode, they're going to provide a digestible version of, is this realistic? That is licensure for personal trainers. Now, this topic of licensure has gone to the front, the back of fitness industry in terms of, is it realistic? Is it important? And what I like about this episode is the honesty provided by our guests. They will discuss, is it a valid option for personal trainers? And what is a possible solution? Now, licensure, in my opinion, is a topic that personal trainers should know. Is it something that affects me as a personal trainer working in this fitness industry? Is it something to come? How can I become prepared? What should I do to make sure that I can continue training my clients and being a professional personal trainer? This episode is going to be split into two different parts, with part one setting the stage of, is licensure a possible solution for personal trainers? Is registry a more viable option? And discussing topics such as the job task analysis as that pertains to the minimum entry to becoming a personal trainer. Let's now get to the episode with Francis and Graham. Make sure you drop a comment on your opinion if licensure or registry is a valid option for personal trainers. With this episode of the KIPS Podcast, we have a rather special topic and a special episode, meaning that we have two guests to talk about licensure, accreditation, things that personal trainers, in my opinion, should know about, should hopefully feel really involved with this type of evolution and seeing how it plays out in different countries. So we have two guests here. We have Francis Neric and Graham Melstrand, both of them established within the fitness industry, done a lot of work on this end. So I'm hoping that we can really dive into these topics and provide answers that people that this stuff is probably flown over the head. Let's start off with Francis. Can you give kind of I can't say a quick summary, but really some insight into licensure? What kind of work has been done in the past and what's going on right now?
First, go beach. I think that's the first thing.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But I think that's probably the most common question that I get is, why aren't exercise professional licensed? And I think the short answer of it, it's complicated.
Yeah.
When you're looking at kind of the components of licensure, and I think you have to kind of start with what is the purpose of licensure before you kind of go to the components. I think the big thing is when you're looking at licensure opportunity, like when you're looking at licensure, rather, it's a big component is, can you keep the public safe? And I think that's when you're looking at it, it's just like, well, if you're going to keep them safe, well, how do you know, or how can you provide reasonable assurances that that individual is safe enough? And so it's a component of a number of things. One is, how are you educated? How did you learn about it? I think is one. The second one is, how do you know, outside of like you learning and you went to college or whatever, how were you assessing whether you're competent or not? I think that's the second component. The third one is, if you're already certified, how do you ensure that they remain competent over time? Because things change. So once you graduate from school, how do I continue to do that? And then the fourth component is, where do I find it?
Mm-hmm.
And that could be through either a state registration or a national registration. So when you're thinking about all four components of it, that's where it is.
Mm-hmm.
When we kind of go back at the very beginning of like, okay, well, how did you learn about it? There's two kind of parts, and I'm not going to get real big into the deep parts of it, I'm going to talk about it from the degree professional perspective, because I think it's a little easier to kind of understand. Yeah. When we're talking about it from the degree component, if I go to college and I went to an exercise science program, did that program prepare me to do the job as, and I'm just going to use the example for us, as an exercise physiologist? Now, the reality is, when you go to university, most of the time you'll always hear, oh, the university is accredited. But what you're really saying, it's institutionally accredited. And what I mean by that's the entire university. I mean, so you think about Cal State Long Beach, it's just like, regardless if I go to the business school or whether I go to the kinesiology school. If I decide that I want to change my major 30 times, can the university support me as a student? Right. So that's the first part of it. And that's usually called regional accreditation. That accredits the university. Right. On the other hand, is if I go to within a department or a program, how is the exercise science program preparing me to do a job as an exercise physiologist? When you think about that, that's called programmatic accreditation. That is a really important because when you compare the licensed professions like physical therapy, nursing, athletic training, for example, you have whatever you learn in class is directly applicable to what you do in the profession. So that becomes really, really, really critical is that are you going through a programmatically accredited exercise science program, right? Or what an accredited physical therapy program or whatever, right? The next component is when you're talking about professional certification. Now, regardless if I go to Cal State Long Beach, which is the best university ever, or if I go to University of Miami or wherever, how do I know that those universities prepared me similarly, right? And sometimes you'll learn something a little bit different because professors teach things differently at one university or the next. Now, when you have that, those are through accredited certifications. Now, when you talk about accredited certifications, it's companies like ACE, ACSM, NSCA, and others, is our job is to ensure that to the public that those individuals who are entering the profession are safe enough, right? We're not beholden to our companies, it's beholden to the public. That's a really important part. So regardless of where you went to school, can this person do the job safely and effectively? And that's what certification fits in. And the last part is once you have that as part of your certification, is it required for you to maintain your competence over time? That is a requirement both for certification and licensure, right? So you have to do it. It's time limited. You have to update your certifications every 2 to 3 years, right? So that's the requirement. When you're looking at that in the total span of it, that's where registration really fits in. And registration contains all of those components, and that has very similar licensure, but you're looking at a national scale that's voluntary versus state requirements. So when you're looking at licensure, that's kind of what we're looking at is which part of it in terms of preparing the profession. Graham, I don't know if I misspoke on any of that.
Well, I think one of the things that I would add to what Francis has shared there is really who's the beneficiary of the accreditation or the type of program. And when you're talking about the institutional and programmatic accreditation, the student is the primary beneficiary of the rigor that's attached to those benefits in order to them. When you get to a professional credential, which Francis has defined as having that competency-based exam, continuing education requirement where you would maintain your current competence and grow. And then the third element is some type of disciplinary process for those that act outside of the scope or the professional codes of conduct. Is that pivots away from that individual that's been educated and now is trying to demonstrate their competence to, as Francis, to benefit the consumer, to make sure that the person that they're working with is reasonably protected from harm. And of course, across occupations, that could be very different depending on what it is. It could be economic harm if you're talking about somebody that works in financial services. There could be different types of harm if you were, say, a criminal defendant and working with an attorney that was inadequately competent. And in health and medicine, it's really making sure that the outcomes of whatever the program or intervention that you provide are well considered, safe, and effective based on the health status of that individual. And in general, there's a whole continuum of consumer protections that on one end is your Yelp rating, if you want to look at it that way, and on the other end, you have very vigorous license and regulation requirements on that, like you would for, say, a pilot of a commercial aircraft on that. And, when the subject of licensure comes up in our space, it's really interesting because Francis and I saw a lot of this, about 15 years ago, Francis, where there were 13 or 14 states that were considering it. But those efforts were based on the character or criminal behavior of a very, very small number of individuals, not the competence of the practitioners that were were certified by organizations like ACSM or NSCA or NCSF. And most of the time, those individuals didn't have any credential whatsoever, or it was the stated Holiday Inn Express last night open book or one day workshop thing. So, Francis, you mentioned athletic training, and you could look at registered dietitians and things like that, where the certification graduation from an accredited academic program and meeting eligibility to work criteria are what's been adopted for licensure in those fields. None of those measures that were proposed, though, ever advanced because of a couple of different reasons. One, they were usually pretty poorly written, but exercise and physical activity are pretty low risk behaviors. So the number of individuals that are being injured when working with a professional is infinitesimally small. It doesn't meet that threshold for that level of government information or intervention, which is why we have registration and certification here in the U.S.
Graham, maybe you can follow this up for our audience members. How is licensure handled in other countries?
Well, it's really interesting. The easy answer is that there aren't any countries currently licensed exercise professionals. In the international community, exercise professionals, by and large, are actually qualified or as vocations, not professions. And most of the individuals that come through the education programs, it's more of what I would describe as a guild model, where there's formal classroom education supported by hands-on education and training, and then some type of vocational work experience underneath the qualified individual. And they have to accumulate a certain number of hours. And depending on the country, there may or may not be a continuing education requirement recommendation. But most countries that are either in the Commonwealth countries or in the EU have national registries or are part of a larger multi-nation registration scheme like Europe Active.
And I remember some of the discussions that I've had both in Australia and the UK. I think a lot of it's like it's this Graham was saying, especially for the higher level professionals, and I would say like a level 4, level 5 type programs. Level 5, level 6 type programs where at least a bachelor's degree or master's degree, it's when you graduate, successfully complete the program or you graduate, you are now the job. Now, the component about that was where it becomes challenging. There's a lot of the times, if not, I don't think most of them do not have a third party verification of competency. Now, what ends up happening is when you're coming in, you end up having a variance between what the minimum standard is, because if every university teaches it differently, you're going to be slightly off. Yes, you have educational standards, but whether you went to Cal State Long Beach, Cal State Fullerton, or University of Miami, and those are the examples. Are the same students graduating doing the same thing? I would say it's not really. It depends on not only what you're learning in the classroom, but then your practical experience that you're gaining in through internships, things like that. So if you apply that into kind of nationally, you run even more complexities there as well.
I'm going to kind of twist things up here and bring in a little bit of accreditation flavor here, because on a recent podcast, the topic of the job task analysis of a personal trainer was brought up, and what both of you are kind of hinting at here with different standards and entry for becoming a personal trainer. That was the first thing that popped in my head. Would you say then that the job task analysis, the minimum entry level for a personal trainer, would that need to be adjusted? I'm just bringing this up from my perspective that I remember when I graduated, I honestly feel like I could have taken any exam, passed it, no problem. I know that I did do that with the organization that I worked for. They didn't look at the material once, but I had already met all those, I've reviewed all those topics over four years of a undergraduate degree. Do you think that looking at the minimum entry then needs to kind of be adjusted?
Maybe. I mean, I think there's just like, it's complicated. I think when you're looking at it from the perspective, when you look at a GATA or a job task analysis, sometimes it's called an exam content outline or role delineation study, whatever it is.
Yeah.
You do this for most occupations. And the occupation is, if you're going to be doing insert job, whatever the job is, what do you need to know? What do you need to be able to perform? And then what are your related abilities, your knowledge, skills, and abilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like, what do you do as part of your job from beginning to end? That's really the purpose of kind of defining kind of like what are within the bounds of your competency. What do you know as a personal trainer or exercise physiologist or strength conditioning coach? What do you need to know?
Mm-hmm.
Some JTAs include the level of complexity that you need to know it. Do you just need to know a little bit, like just be able to recall information, or do you need to take a lot of information and apply it at a very deep level? The higher risk clientele that you're working with, the deeper the knowledge you need to know. So as Graham was saying, exercise and physical activity generally is pretty safe, right? So I think there's part of it is just like, so we're looking at the entry level professional into, say, personal training or group exercise. If it's generally safe, then you're like, well, how much knowledge from a university curriculum do you need? When you're looking at personal training or group exercise, often it's just people who are just generally interested for their own health benefit. And so can you learn those knowledge and skills on your own? Potentially. If you're looking at the higher level iterations of it, say strength and conditioning, where you're working with elite level athletes, for example, are you max squatting Patrick Mahomes? Probably not, right? Do you need to do a movement evaluation? Yes. So there are higher level orders. When you're talking about working with Olympians, you start getting into more complex exercise schemas.
Mm-hmm.
While you certainly can learn that on your own, the scientific side of it becomes very important. You're trying to elicit greater benefit to an elite athlete. On the opposite side, for the clinical ones, what is the level of risk for injury and or death? If somebody is in cardiac rehab programs or they're going through cancer treatments, you need to know like not only the pharmacology of it all, you need to know like contraindications, and you have to be able to communicate with licensed professionals, physicians, nurses, physical therapists, in a way that you're like, okay, if it's patient-centered care, how do we effectively work together? You can't necessarily learn on your own either. So you have to add in the educational requirements like, gosh, maybe you have bachelor's degree or master's degree, but ultimately, how are you applying that early learning in the classroom to actual practice? So to say like, oh, everyone needs a bachelor's degree personal trainer, it's like, in my opinion, I think it's a bit much. To say if you want to work in cardiac rehab, I say that's a minimum. Probably that's fair, right? Because I think that's where it is. When you're looking at job task analyses, I think when you're looking at it from that perspective, just like, well, what is it? I think you have to look at it as just like those knowledge and skills at a minimum. But when you look at certified personal trainers, like an NCCA accredited certification, and I'm going to say, frankly, just ACE, NSCA, NCSF, NSCA, and others that are similar, they're essentially a commodity because you're doing it the same way, right? Because
your subject matter experts are often the same in terms of the exam development and who you're surveying. So Tyler, I think there's an important thing that you've identified there, though, is that there has to be a partnership between the credentialing organizations that are doing those job task analysis and role delineation studies and the active programmatic accreditors to make sure that they cover all of those content, knowledge, skills, and abilities areas that way. And so because occupations are always evolving, two things happen. One is some of those expectations around the knowledge, skills, and abilities and capabilities of the practitioners grow over time, and that needs to influence what's being taught in the formal academic setting. One of the challenges that Francis alluded to in exercise science is that a lot of the academic programs are really pre-professional. They're providing education to prepare people for graduate school or alternately for physical therapy or medical school. And in those programs, they're not necessarily thinking about somebody that wants to get off the elevator and be a personal trainer or an exercise physiologist. I won't say clinical exercise physiologist because that is a very focused approach on that. In strength and conditioning, is as well, because the pedigree associated with your institution and who you interned under are really critical to your success and your placement. One of the things that's probably not talked enough about, and we've actually worked with CREP hand in hand with the PAA, is the idea of making sure that we address the broad needs of the population, and you can do that through a national referral framework where the physician and how much oversight they need to provide for their patient based on the health status of the individual dictates who's the most appropriate person to refer to. And whether you went to college and earned a bachelor's or you did self-study, the personal trainer exam that you have to pass if you're going through Francis's organization is the same. It's going to screen out the individuals that are not fit to do that work, but making sure that you can accommodate that broad base of registered dietitian. Most people don't have access to them because beyond that 1 or 2 visits a year, it's self-pay. So you want to make sure that people have access to the leadership and expertise in commercial fitness environments as well as those clinical and high performance settings.
A lot of questions. Go ahead.
Really, really quick on it. I think one of the things when you're looking at GTAs is when you pass an exam, I think a lot of folks don't quite understand what happens when you pass a certification exam. Their certification exams is like, okay, well, you're trying to identify who are the best of the best. And that's not the purpose of it. The passing a certification exams means you're minimally competent, which means, and I kind of joke about this, but I'm being serious about it. It's just like, who is your C- student? Who barely passed your class, right? So where's that line of the sand of just like, they're marginally dangerous? It's like, it's just, they know enough not to hurt, kill somebody. But that is kind of the line. If you're looking at kind of like, if I'm trying to get them, where am I going? You know what? They are a danger to society versus I can potentially be okay. I'm getting to the starting line, right? What you're describing, I think at the top, I think when you're looking at JTAs, should the barrier be even further over? And I think that's where you're like, not necessarily. That's really kind of the purpose of when you're talking to employers is how do you identify or screen out those who are the most and best qualified, who are going to be the most successful? That's different. That's a different answer. So when you're looking at JTAs, frankly, I think that's the thing you got to remember. It's just like it gets you to the starting line. And then once you're at the starting line, it's just like, how do I grow or become successful as a professional? That's a totally different story.
Yeah.
Competence and success are two different things. And licensure and certification exams, again, are for the consumer, which is why you don't necessarily see some of those business and marketing and communication skills built in, because you're not likely to have the adverse effects for consumers associated with that. Now, the thing is sometimes it's a timing issue too. So I have a friend who's an architect, and the requirement when she went to and graduated and entered that field was a master's degree, but she interned under individuals that were educated through apprenticeship. So, the fields evolve over time, and that's okay. I expect that that's going to happen for us in this space as well.
Yeah. I mean, what you mentioned there, in my opinion, is a pathway to better personal trainers, hopefully a lower turnover rate in the form of internships, apprenticeship. Those are things that give personal trainers hands-on experience that hopefully improve longevity. I kind of want to go back to this question with the job task analysis. I'm going to bring in the organization US Reps, which Francis is a part of, as that could be a great area to provide insight for our listeners on with we'll call it a standardized JTA potentially. Would US Reps be able to handle something like that, or would that kind of fall into the lap of US Reps?
Potentially. I think is when you're looking at JTAs, and I think it depends on the job role. So when you're thinking about US Reps, the US Register of Veterinary Professionals represents about 130 to 140,000 professionals that are on the register. And the ones who are on the register are ACE, NSCA, ECSM, NCSF, NCCPT.
Yes.
And then the College Strength and Conditioning Association, the CSCCA. So when you're looking at those member organizations, they put their certified professionals immediately into the register. And the intention of that is really to be a public-facing resource to say these are professionals who are coming from the member organizations. They have taken and passed our accredited certifications, and here's where they're located. Uh-huh. So for us, it's like being able to screen out individuals who are faking certification or credentials that they have. And so it's really to the employers to be able to go, okay, look, I want to screen our candidate pool. Are these individuals legitimate certified professionals versus taking a piece of paper that you can just Photoshop? So it's really a public-facing resource in same way, not only for employers, but for like Joe Public or Jane Public. They're interested in whether they're saying, oh yeah, I'm certified and here's the organization. They can check it and verify what it is. Mm-hmm. Now, to the JTA question.
That's for a current credential too, not for one that they've earned and allowed to expire.
That's correct. It's active, right? So when you're talking about it from the perspective, and I'm going to talk about theoretically, right? So when you're looking at a job role that's substantially similar between the member organizations, personal training would probably be the highest level order of it. Now, where they're across the same, you look at the knowledge areas, the content and domain areas, and then also within it, the tasks that you do as part of your job. So, do your client intake forms, et cetera. How do I analyze it? Things like that. They're probably the same. If you were to do a comparison, in which we did before, you do what's called a crosswalk. You take all the 6 member organizations and you compare their personal trainer programs. The one that doesn't have one, CSCCA, but you compare the ones who have personal trainer programs. The overlap, my gosh, I think we did a gram. I think it was like 95, 98%. Yes. It was a substantial overlap between the organizations. Theoretically, you could have one job task analysis across all member organizations. So you're creating an opportunity to go, hey, look, we all believe in the role of a personal trainer, and they have to have these knowledge and skills and abilities to be safe and effective. Would you do it? Probably. You could probably do it. You would need to discuss that, I think, among the member organizations that they're interested in. That's certainly open to other NCCA accredited organizations if they want to join. But yes, that there is an opportunity to do it from a psychometric perspective. It's an opportunity to do it. And then if you're able to kind of have the same one, there's a lot of value there. And especially when you're talking about the register, if you're trying to make comparisons to the licensure, if we all believe it and we all show it, I think there's a greater value to it. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's organized by the job role. Yeah, I agree on that. I think, Tyler, one of the things that's so interesting is that, the nuances when Francis talks about that 5% variance, it's really organizational heritage. So Francis's organization would be naturally tied to the research and the clinical setting. Organizations that offer strength and conditioning credentials would be the sports performance would be their authenticity, if you will. And then the other organizations like ACE, NCSF kind of straddles the fence on that, but are focused on what I would describe as membership-based fitness, so commercial fitness in terms of their heritage. They translate the science rather than do the research. In many cases, ACSM obviously has a clear heritage there, but that's like trying to decide, do you want a Mercedes or a BMW or an Audi? They're substantially similar in that way and provide those assurances around the job role that to hire that individual, if it's a good fit for your facility's culture, that they're probably, be competent and well prepared to serve their clients, members, and patients.
Yeah. What I like about this talk, and this is something that probably 10, 13 years ago, this was my issue with the whole accreditation process, was in theory, somebody taking one program from an NCCA accredited program should be able to take another exam. If there is a standardized JTA and everybody's agreed upon it, that should in theory hold. That was my issue with it. So talking about it now, it's I like the idea of it, and I know that other fitness educators have discussed that with me as well, that there should be some type of standard barrier to entry or job task analysis that the companies share. And there's kind of been a little bit of stir, I'll say, that just from how the things have changed in my perspective, back when I was working on accreditation applications and going through different job task analysis and publishing those out to the public, I remember when I worked at Nesta, we would publish the whole thing. Now, looking in the last 6 months, when I've looked at different organizations, that information is very hard to find, very little bit of it. So I think that the standardization of it, as Francis mentioned, if there could be one, to say that the U.S. reps collectively came together, here is what we believe that is the minimum qualification for a personal trainer, I think that would be very helpful. And I think it would open up.
I will say that organizations or NCC accredited are required to show their exam content outline. So it's not like they're hiding it. It is a requirement for each of those organizations to put out their exam content outline. Sometimes it's called DCO or detailed content outline or role delineation. Sometimes the naming convention is a little different depending on who your psychometrician is. So when you're looking at it, it is a requirement, but you have to publish it. Now,
and where it's published may vary a little bit. It's usually in the exam candidate handbook.
And I think there's that. Now, is there an opportunity? I think the answer is absolutely. Awesome. I think when you're looking at opportunities for that, and I want to kind of go back to your comment of that you could, if you have studied enough, you should be able to pass an exam. And the reality is that is the point. That's the point, right? Because if you're looking at and this is what our psychometrician was kind of telling us back when I was at the NSCA, is just like, if you have a solid enough credentialing program, you should not have any sort of requirements because it'll screen out those who know it from those who don't.
Yes.
Right. So at that point, it's just like, if you're a personal trainer, any exam, if you've been working as a personal trainer and you're doing it in the way that is expected by the public to do safe and effective, you should be able to sit and take any of the exams and pass, right? That is the exact point. Now, for you to say the same thing, it's just like, hey, I can take the medical boards or the law boards and pass by just reading a book or two. That is something wrong with that board exam, right? Yes. Because I think that's when you're looking at it from that perspective. When you're looking at it from the employer's perspective, and you're trying to hire somebody, it's just like, I have some confidence that this person may be successful, right? They're going to be successful. They're going to have, they can do it. And I have reasonable assurances that I'm not going to get sued by hiring this person. That's the point. So when if you had a common JTA, I think that adds value to that, especially if you're trying to do like-to-like comparisons of registered exercise professionals in comparison to a registered dietitian or registered nurse. The registration, in my opinion, is going to become much more important than the actual certification exam.
That has been it for part 1 on the topic of licensure and registry for personal trainers. In the description, you can find information about our guests and the organizations that they represent. Make sure you stay on the lookout for part 2. And again, make sure you leave a comment on what you think about this topic and is it realistic for personal trainers.